All right, lead Mrs. Grant. This is one that I would say comes down to too much of a good thing. By that I don't mean, it's a cool game, but it's too long or too complex, too big, whatever. No, rather I mean the systems which I find pleasant and exciting early in the game devolve into something really ugly as you get close to the end of the game. I don't know if that's the case with the short scenarios, but with the campaign scenario, there's two things at play here, which might mean that the short scenarios suffer this too. One is this race for victory points at the end of the game, which involves trying to establish supply lines, and that'll only apply for the advanced game, but let me look at what the advanced game scenarios are. There are several smaller ones that are short term, and those might have the same problem. But for the full campaign, you have all these units converging in one place, and those supply line, the logistics of trying to break or maintain a supply line just become this incredibly complicated problem, and it's not even one that you can ever solve, which may be a good thing, completely, because it's somewhat luck-based, based on what the initiatives are. Now, in part, though, you look at this and say, this is really cool. If players are playing it, approximately equally, both players are playing, close to the victory line, whatever that is, between, one side and the other winning, or anything really, any line. The difference between being winning or losing, or different levels of victory, or whatever you want to take it, can come down to just a die roll, and it can be pretty major, and that can be exciting because it's not even just a single die roll, it's a series of die rolls, and someone could get very lucky or very unlucky, and that could decide the game at that point. And I actually kind of like things like that. I don't think that the game generally is going to be hinging on that, and that's because I'm not so sure that the balance is all that good. As I said in my wrap-up, I think the Confederates have a much harder job in this game. I think the Union can kind of expect to get a marginal victory, and anything above that is a definite Union victory, and anything below that strikes me as more of a Confederate victory. How much more? How long do you make the siege? That's just my impression. I haven't played it a whole hell of a lot of times. I'm perfectly willing to accept, if somebody comes back and says, well, I can always win with the Confederates, okay, you're probably a better player, and you probably could always win with whichever side you took, against me at least. Anyway. Some more words about it. Component-wise, all right, I haven't gotten into this. Victory games, the dice that they used are really awful. I mean, they're not the lowest end dice you can get, but they were a little questionable, sometimes skewed and didn't have good quality control on them. I never used my Victory Games dice. And in fact, I kind of feared my Gamer's dice because they look like the Victory Games dice, but the quality on them seems to be higher. What's expected in terms of you don't have a lopsided die. So I'm always using different dice. Now, I use different dice for all my games anyway, and that's why it never gets mentioned, but I do want to bring that out because I found that was one of the weak spots. So if you get a Victory Games game and it don't expect to get decent dice with it. Expect that you'll want to replace the dice probably, or it's quite a possibility. Maybe we're talking like 20% of the dice had a problem, right? But they were enough that I just never used them because I don't trust the ones that don't obviously have a problem. Other facets about this. Now, Very, very pretty. Looks like, with no great surprise there, it looks like, it's not Simonson, but it looks like the late Simonson maps from SPI. And, very functional, attractive. They're on very heavy stock. Sounds like a great thing. Too much of a good thing. You put the heavy stock, COA, Clash of Arms has this issue. You put a heavy stock map down and they pooch a little bit more. And they don't really lie flat. If you like Plexi, hey, that's great. And unlike the Clash of Arms maps, there's no real, oh my God, I can't use Plexi on this map. They're solid though, and they hold up well under pressure. Player aid card, I'm excited about that. Wipe the back off. Another player aid card. This is sort of what the players are going to be referring to during the game. It would be kind of useful to have 2 of these. Sad that there's only one. They also don't have quite enough information on it, but it's full. The one piece of information I would like on it that I would add, not this, which is actually on there, is a list for the campaign game of the railroad values. And you could just scratch that together. It's in the rulebook. But that was the thing that I found myself referring to the most that's not on the player aid card. And there are things that are on the player aid card that I barely look at. For example, the ratio chart, which is basically figure out your odds ratio, subtract 1 from the absolute value, and that's going to be the modifier. But, whatever. The terrain effects chart. I very seldom looked at that because it very quickly memorizes, but I wouldn't want to lose that. The valley table. Now that's only for the campaign game, and, it belongs there, but whatever. I found myself more interested in the victory condition because the valley got resolved right away. Counters, side-mounted, glossy, not my favorites. You could see I had trouble keeping stacks together where map pooches were. They probably held together better before I clipped them. But otherwise functional. Bunches and bunches of strength point counters, and you potentially need them all, but a lot of the counter mix is used up on things that you probably are going to look at and say, well, did I really need 21 strength point markers? And every strength point marker is individual because it has an organized and a disorganized side. So you can't kind of double up with that. One marker that I found I would have liked the forts and fortresses to be color-coded by the side that has them. Again, the game has tons of counters. It's a big ask. But that was something that I found difficult while I was playing. Another thing on the map, things get cluttered in the map. And the roads are hard to see. And the roads are really, really key. Not just for movement when you're pawing through and looking for that, but for broader ideas like, am I in supply? There's lots of little places where you have to be worried about that. And the supply system works really, really cool early in the game, but as you get down to the nitty-gritty part where everything's all clustered together, that mechanism and the interaction of the way the zones of control work in this, where you have to paw through and find out the strength of the unit, you have to look at the map and see, maybe whether or not there are roads present, and the status of the entrenchment of the unit. It just creates this huge set of variables that determine whether or not a given hex is part of a supply line. That was probably the biggest headache to the whole thing, and it got to be very much a headache at the end of the game. The rulebook itself reads wonderfully. It's split, however, into a basic and advanced game. Most of the rules in the basic game, but it does mean that you have to flip past the base game scenario to get to the advanced game. I never like when that happens. Nothing's really withdrawn from the rules or anything like that. For whatever reason, I found it hard. And I don't know, victory games may do this to me. I have trouble sometimes with
remembering where in the rules something is. And I found that difficult here. Now, some of it may be a personal issue with the use of images and such not, without lots of little paragraph numbers and everything. Somehow that just doesn't stick well for me. And that there's no good reason that I can really argue that the rules should be that way rather than this, except that it works better for me. But I do think that there were things that were in kind of weird places. And there may not have been a perfect place to put it, but when you start putting in lots and lots of reference numbers, it becomes easier to cross-reference. It's also a large rule book. It weighs in at 64 pages, including, a lot of historical information. Several pages of historical notes, several pages of scenarios. And then it's got, these nice columns that I always like in Victor games. I like the presentation of it. It reads well, because then I can look over, examples will be over here, specific call-outs will be over there, stuff like that. And I find that all very nice when I'm reading the rules, but I find it not as effective as a reference manual. It's also printed on nice heavy stuff. For the play of the game, well, I've kind of given you it all in the summary, which is that it's really, really exciting and then gets to be this huge headache. But what makes it so exciting is a combination, I forgot my sequence of play, a combination of this pulsed movement thing that I always have sort of a love-hate relationship with, because I roll dice or whatever happens to determine who has the initiative, who has to make a decision. And now they have a hard decision to make, right? Which piece do I do? What do I do? What action can I take? In this, that decision can be pretty tough at times, because sometimes you're just playing out, I want to flip a piece, just to get this particular action over, because I've got some key ones that are coming up that I need to delay on. So there's a lot of times where you're playing this waiting game, and that feels a little funky to me. Especially since there are kind of gamey ways to manipulate that. Not just in terms of, oh yeah, well, my guy down in Petersburg is going to flip over and do nothing, and somehow that gives me an advantage up on the North Anna. What? Why? I don't know. You could probably try to come up with some hand-wavy explanation, but nothing good. The decision to break the supply sequence on the game turn basis, and a number of other things that are kind of based on supplies. Reinforcements, for example, is kind of supply-based. Railroad destruction is supply-based. But to have 3 action cycles inside each game turn, right? And the action cycles allow you to move all your pieces during an action cycle. Basically, every piece on the board gets an opportunity to do something. And that's something maybe just to wait around and do some end of cycle cleanup type stuff, where they reorganize and stuff, as long as they haven't done anything. But supply only happens every third one. Creates this sort of artificial limitation on, oh, okay, I only check supply after I've moved X number of times. So I'm moving and fighting and everything, and my supplies don't matter. And oh, now my supplies matter, my strength has been weakened. Doesn't seem to take into account truly military supplies either in this live system, because my unit can be out of supply and then pass for an action cycle and forage, and now it's as good at fighting. Now, the as good at fighting may mean that I'm not spread out foraging and protecting my supply line or whatever, but it seems like no matter where you are, you can get your ammo, your artillery ammo or whatever you need to operate. That's going to just come to you for free. You're never going to be in a situation where your supply situation reduces your ammunition. premonition capability. Because at any time, if you rest long enough, now that may be if you rest long enough, you're in a location and your supply finds it to you. But it doesn't quite feel like it aligns properly, especially if you're in a siege situation and you don't have access to ammo for, say, I don't know, a few action cycles or whatever, a few turns even. You can just survive on that. Well, being out of supply for turns is bad. You'll start losing strength points permanently off of that. Okay, so the pulsing is a really cool thing, but again, when you start playing with time, and now here's the thing with that time delimiter around a game turn with three different movement cycles, how different is that really between like your normal I go, you go, hey, I got to move my units, now I can check, now I must check supply for all of them. There's sort of this, as long as the movement and supply isn't all continually happening, there's something wrong anyway. So why am I fixating on this? I can't really give you a good answer to that. It just bothers me more. All right. The actual combat in the game is handled through what Berg calls a reducto ad absurdum methodology, where basically you're just rolling opposed dice against each other with modifiers, and one of the modifiers is how big is you compared to the other guy. And then casualties are reflected by the size of the force receiving them, so it's kind of hard to squish a little force completely, but that actually works out kind of right, because like you're in good terrain and everything. Maybe you can fade away and find another place where you can dig in, or something along those lines. Because digging in doesn't seem to just mean, yeah, I got some entrenchments. It seems to mean you mean to stay in that hex. The rationale behind that is one of the supply rules is that you can't cut supply unless you're dug in. Well, now, honestly, troops in a fort under siege, or troops, under siege in breastworks, are very unlikely to be projecting a lot of inhibitory forces out there to try to interdict supply or whatever. And it just seems to indicate this lack of movement for the unit more than anything else, that it's settled in that location and actually patrolling it. Now, that settling in a location does correspond with, let's dig in, let's defend it a little better, because we're not constantly on the march. So that all works reasonably well. The problem only comes when you start trying to assess supply, and it starts becoming this really complex problem. But the other problem with it is it kind of goes against what we've learned from all the other war games we've played, which is, I'm there, I've got this zone, my supply, I'm going to cut your supply this way. Yeah, you don't do that in this game, and that's very hard to kind of bury into your consciousness so that you can just do it without thinking. And I found that I couldn't. I was having trouble with it consistently because it doesn't meet the standards. And that's one of the things. There's a lot of little innovative ideas, etc. Innovative ideas are really cool, and you look at them and say, wow, that's a great way to handle that. Except that they're harder to remember, and you have to paw through the rule book to get to things that have been well covered by sort of your standard system. I feel like I'm hosed either way, because I feel like, that standard system just feels too flavorless. It doesn't really, it certainly doesn't create the experience that this creates in terms of this sort of fluid trying to outfox the other person with maneuver. However, this system comes at a price, and that price really starts to show when things get congested. Like me. Other systems that are really, really exciting. Okay, so the Union has this remarkable capability to like shift their supply along the coastal waterways, rivers coming up from the Atlantic, and in gameplay terms, that gives them a tremendous flexibility as to they don't have to stand on any line, and that creates some of the excitement to it. But it's also part of what makes, I think, the Confederate job very, very difficult, and probably, it factors into the balance situation. Maybe a very good Confederate player can continually stop the Union, but there's no guarantees no matter what, because it does come down to the initiative die rolls and capable playing of them. But assuming both players can do very, very well and can figure out exactly what they want to do and how they want to do it in the order they want to do it, you can get screwed still by, I was forced to go before him or after him, in certain circumstances because of some die rolls, which is fine. I mean, to me, a simulation requires a certain amount of luck. The fact that maneuver has the luck basis on it, on multiple layers too. Your movement rate is determined by a die roll too. So the fact that maneuver is actually probably the more luck-based facet of the game, I find particularly appealing. Far too often, by the time you get to the battlefield and deploy your forces, the battle is determined. Whether there probably isn't going to be, on a tactical level, too many brilliant things that you can do when you're outnumbered 2-1 and partially surrounded, right? So it's at that operational or grand tactical level, depending, that the battle's kind of won or lost in this period. Which means, this is sort of the perfect layer to look at and understand how a great general, can win a battle. You look at a Gettysburg game, and you're like, well, victory conditions say I got to go up there, and I'm going to get slaughtered going up there, but maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe I'll play the little combat odds a little better, or whatever. Whatever it turns out to be, it generally is more of a. I feel like those tactical games are more of something you just watch happen. There's not a whole hell of a lot in most of them that you can really do. Now, you start adding different things into it beyond the straight, hey, I've got a fixed movement allowance, I can calculate where I'm going to go, and it's the combat results table that adds the randomness. Once you go beyond that, you might be able to get a little bit more, but it still becomes the kind of gamey stuff like this is, as opposed to necessarily providing you with the same level of, I don't know. I guess it would still be there on the tactical level. And what it gives you, between the pulsing and the randomness to the movement and all that, what it gives you is this sort of move, counter move type feel to this whole game. Where you're saying, okay, I can't move that piece yet because I need to know what those pieces are doing. And once you commit to something, the other person can commit the counter to that. So that does create the I don't want to move a piece feeling, though. No, you don't have that option. You have to move a piece. I guess that's really about it. I think that it's a really interesting and innovative system. I've looked at, I said this in the other videos, I've looked at but not played its descendant, The Great Campaigns of the American Civil War, which is more detailed. I thought it would solve the timing problem that I have, but it doesn't, because although it gives like the equivalent of one action cycle as a game turn in them, supplies every X number of game turns instead of, So yeah, I'll have the same problem there. It's got more detail. It covers a few things that I say, oh, this really bugged me about this, like, shouldn't generals have some tactical capabilities? Some of them are real bozos. So if you want to express the difference between, say, Rosecrans and I don't know, Thomas, right? It's sort of your perfect situation there. Thomas was pretty decent tactically. His men loved him, and he was able to get more out of them on the battlefield than they normally would, but he had the slows. And if you look at Rosecrans, he really didn't do that well when he was actually able to bring a battle about, but he tried to do neat maneuvers and stuff and to move quickly in ways that you kind of have to express both of those. And this system fails to express the tactical side of the leaders. The Great Campaigns does. Just a number of things like that, where it's obviously derived from this, but it seems to both go into more detail and maybe try to fix problems a few people have had. Anyway, I have kind of mixed feelings on this because I love it so much at the beginning of the campaign, and I feel like I'm playing such an exciting game. And then as it winds down, I start realizing, boy, this thing is turning into a real headache. My own emotional state, etc., was troubled, obviously, so, that may factor into it. But all I've done is taken my initial first blush of starting playing it again, which bumped it from a 7 to an 8 in my rating system, and dropped it back down to where I had it, which was at a 7, which is just kind of the, there's a significant fiddliness to this one too, which is you might have a lot of pieces on the board. Every piece you move gets flipped over. You have to paw through stacks with forts and stuff to understand whether something's in supply. You have to look at the map as well. It's often very cluttered to see if you've got the supply line where you really want it and if it's going to work. And then you have to project into the future and try to guess whether or not your enemy is going to be able to intercept, screw up your supply line. But that's something different. At the end of each action cycle, you have to go back and unflip all the flipped units. Okay, that happens in some games, but because there's and you can't just have a side 1 and side 2 to be different turns or something. It doesn't work that way because casual fighting can cause you to flip and fatigue. In addition, units that aren't commanders who aren't flipped, their units might be disorganized, and you have to check all of them and unflip the disorganized units, build forts, blah, blah, blah. And finally, at the end of each turn, or at the beginning of each turn, you have the supply check, which can change the organization status. And this is what's really weird. It's like you have the regular action cycle is like, okay, I move, I'm disorganized, maybe I better sit back and rest. Not on the third action cycle, you shouldn't, and you should always force march on the third action cycle unless you're going into combat. In which case you might want to, but you should always force march because you can get those extra movement points. And it's not going to cost you if you're still in supply, because you will unflip at the beginning of the turn outside this action cycle sequence. And on the same side, you might be disorganized at the beginning of a turn, which means on the first action cycle, you need to either rest or something else. And what you're not going to be able, there are things that you're not able to do because of that. Hey, I could have been in supply for action cycles 2, 3, I don't know, and 1, but I couldn't be in supply just at 1. I don't know. I'm really not sure why that would be a particular issue. But notably, your supply could be disrupted in action cycle 2. Let's say you're destroying railroads where you need to be in supply at the beginning of the turn and at the end of the turn. Your supply could be disrupted during action cycle 2 for a period of time, and that will not cause you any problems. Whereas if it's disrupted on action cycle 3, you won't be able to complete the railroad destruction. I don't know. You know, just it's kind of a weirdness. Anyway, I think it's a pretty cool game with some neat ideas. I am a little worried that the Great Campaigns is going to be even fiddlier, but it may have situations that are more like the beginning of the game instead of, you know, devolving into this siege of Richmond and trying to cut the rail lines. I don't know. We'll have to see, you know, how it works out, because it does feel good. The broader the front is, the better it feels. But this game funnels you towards Richmond all game long, and your supply line is also, you're anchored to these rivers. You can't use the rails as your supply. So the Union, I feel like the Union should be able to repurpose Confederate rail lines. The amount of time that the game presents as isn't very long, though. So I'm not sure. If it was a possibility, it would have to be a very poor choice compared to the river supply, because converting rail lines is going to take you longer, and running your supply through them. That's going to take you longer than just, you know, dumping a depot on the river line would, I think. But not sure. All right. And I don't know where I'm going in the future because life is chaos.